Good, amazing for coming along. Thank you so much. It's just me, I'm afraid. So I think most of this is going to probably be got out of by you guys asking questions. I'll go through a little bit of stuff in terms of the paper. But yeah, I mean, if you want to raise your hand, I think you probably know where to do that. It's in the reactions at the top of the screen. You've got the raise hand feature. Definitely whack that in. Or if you want to ask a question by voice, or you can obviously put them in the chat. Basically, this session is made by what you guys want to make of it. So definitely start whacking questions in whenever if anything occurs to you, and I'll sort of run through them basically as they come. To start with, basically, this is primary to look at the ELAT. Though if you've got questions about sort of general admissions process, Oxford sort of things, then by all means pop those in as well. The ELAT paper, as you all might know, is comes up every year, and it's just a collection of some extracts, usually 6 extracts, I think, from a collection of sources to be honest, completely anywhere. It's impossible to predict what will come up on the ELAT. So don't worry if you don't know any of the things. In fact, they're trying to make sure you don't know the things because they want you to go in all on a kind of level playing field. And everyone who applies to Oxford or Cambridge takes the ELAT. And it's essentially you sit down and they ask you to compare any of the 2 sources out of the 6 that you want in any ways that seem interesting to you. Sorry, making kind of a particular notice of kind of critical points. So your kind of start of the style and all the kind of literary features that you talk about in sort of secondary school and right the way through into A-level. I'm presuming most of you are probably taking some kind of English A-level. That's basically it in terms of the way the paper works. You're presented with these 6 sources. They're usually united by a single theme. So like this year's one was dancing, for example, and the previous year was clothes. And there's been loads. You can check them all out on the I think on the Cambridge testing website. They've got them all at the moment. That's pretty easy to get hold of. If you just put ELAT past papers in, you will find an ample selection. I know there's a few questions people have put in advance, so I'm just going to have a quick browse through those. But basically, it's the same kind of question every year. So it's always that structure of compare 2 of these in any ways that seem interesting to you, making particular notice of critical points of style and content. So it's very much like the similar kind of features that you'd be doing in any kind of essay or exam for sort of English or any other essay subject, really, particularly for English, because you're analysing those particular features. But other than that, it's kind of up to you what you do with it. It's really very free form. You can compare them in any ways that seem interesting to you. They're very keen on you kind of getting quite deep into the analysis, which is why it's really important to plan. It's quite a short amount of time, so kind of getting it down to a few minutes planning each time is really helpful to have. That's the main way to practice for it, to be honest, is past papers, I would say, because apart from anything else, it's nice not to go in with no idea whatsoever of what you're facing and have a kind of a fairly good idea of the question as it stands. So, and you can see the question online very, very easily and get an idea of the kind of text that come up. It's an absolute range of text, usually extracts, sometimes a few standalones, but usually if there's standalones, there'll be poems, because poems can be shorter. You struggle to find a novel that fit onto one page of the ELAT exam, though there probably are a few out there, if anyone's read any weird experimental fiction. By all means, by the way, while I'm talking, start whacking messages into the chat, and don't be afraid that no question will sound too stupid. I promise there's no such thing as a stupid question when it comes to the ELAT, because they are very, very strange papers, and there's some very, very strange questions in there. So by all means, drop questions in there, because if you don't, no one else will, and then we'll be sat here kind of twiddling our thumbs. So yeah, that's the way it works pretty much. Now, in terms of how long you get, that's a very good question, and it's one I will quickly check for you. It's one of those situations where it varies slightly, because I personally, without kind of getting too into it, I had extra time and I didn't mind, and that's another thing you want to do if you want to, is get your teacher to talk to you about if you do feel you need any kind of exam arrangements. The normal paper length is 1 hour and 30, so you get 1.5 hours total. And you basically just answer one question. So it's that one question that I've gone back to before, and I will read it out word for word for you. And the question is, so you get all 6 of your paper, your extracts, and then the question is, select 2 passages from A to F and compare and contrast them in any ways that seem interesting to you, paying particular attention to distinctive features of structure, language, and style. And they're kind of assessing your responsivity to like very difficult, like weird passages that you've never come across before. Some of them will seem impenetrable to you. Some of them will seem very, very easy. And basically just go for a bit of a mixture. You know, as they say, and it really is about whatever interests you. Yeah, 1.5 hours. Most people wouldn't write more than 1,200 words. I don't think I've ever seen a kind of like reasonable ELAT passage that's longer than 1,200 words. Really good ones tend to be about that length. I'm just kind of keeping the chat an eye on that while we go. So maybe do some practices, see how long it takes you to write sort of a few pages, and then work out how much time you want to plan for, because obviously your essay will be better if you plan, because you'll basically, once you get to kind of degree level, and this is a good jumping point between sort of A level and degree, the ELAT, there's more focus on your style and your ability to put together an argument as much as there is on what other people sort of say about them. So I know at A level a few people get kind of involved with criticism and this kind of stuff. Not everyone will, and don't worry if you haven't, but criticism is kind of becomes more interesting, and you can kind of talk about that a little bit. And obviously the A level, I think a lot of the A level questions tend to focus on a kind of quote from a critic or something. That's also the case at degree, but it becomes more and more involved. So you're kind of more and more expected to put together an argument. That's not something that you'll be able to do perfectly at ELAT level. No one is expecting you to. I still can't do it perfectly now, and I'm 2 years into a degree in the thing. So it's something that you're constantly working on. But getting kind of to grips with the idea of not just pointing out things that seem interesting, but sort of sewing them together a little bit in a way that says, okay, well, this is what I think about a wider topic that's kind of implied by those texts, right? So for next question. So what's the time range of the text? I.e., what's the oldest they could reasonably give us in past papers? This seems to be Shakespeare. What about, say, Chaucer? If they were going to give you something really, really old, like Chaucerian, they would give you probably some kind of translation or something that's kind of adapted from Chaucer. I don't know of one that Chaucer was like given, because like making someone read Middle English when they've never touched it before, first time in the ELAT, would be pretty harsh. We don't really get to Chaucer until the first year of the degree. In fact, we don't really get Chaucer the second year. You get some Old English in the first year of the degree, but Chaucer doesn't really turn up until the second year. So I don't think they'd go quite that harsh on you. Even I saw a text from a poem last week. I was writing some ELAT work solutions last week for a guide, and they had some guides on for particular words. So like, for example, there was a word that I can't remember for the life of me what the word was, but a word came up and they were like, no one's going to have any idea what this is. You'll be very lucky if you do. So they gave a little asterisk just telling you what that word meant. So I wouldn't expect it to go that bad if that's what you're worried about from the time range thing. Shakespeare sometimes comes up in there. It's worth having a little bit of a kind of understanding of a little bit of Shakespeare, just so you're in the brain space of, I can read Shakespeare and it doesn't seem completely impenetrable to me. But you don't need to worry about bringing context from other Shakespeare plays. That's not something they expect. They don't expect any kind of context at all. In fact, really, they discourage it. You're supposed to kind of really focus on the text as they're given to you, because some people will never have heard of most of the writers. You might have heard of Virginia Woolf, but there's a good chance you've never read any of her stuff. And so the chances of you having knowing what, so it was The Journey Out was the one I was writing about the other day. The chance of you having read The Journey Out, which I've not, were really, really low. So the chance of you knowing anything about it is pretty unlikely. Do you analyze the text in relation to perspectives or generally? I'm not 100% sure what you mean by that, but I mean, in terms of like critical perspectives, like things like if you're talking about things like eco-criticism or like any kind of particular critical approach, there's hundreds and hundreds about feminism, whatever you want to go for, or post-colonial criticism, you can bring those things in if you want, though they wouldn't normally expect you to bring in actual critics or actual points of view. But if you want to apply the kind of, if you're writing about something that is discussing something relevant to post-colonialism, whether it be sort of slavery or immigration or these kinds of things, then that's absolutely fine. But the main thing is to try and get in deep with the text and actually talk about the text themselves and the way they kind of like fit together in their structure, their language, their style, right? Where do you take the ELAT? Is it from your college or do you need to go somewhere else? So if you're at a sixth form or anything like that, then the chances are that they will run the ELAT. You want to ask your teacher about that specifically, though most sixth form colleges, certainly, and probably most school sixth forms do run it because they have at least 1 or 2 people a year who take it. If you don't, then there are testing centres, so another sixth form nearby or other places that will do it. Best thing to do is to talk to your teacher first and find out whether your college or school does it. Chances are they probably do, but if they don't, get their help on where to go, or you can get in contact with the admissions people at Oxford and Cambridge. They've got a good chance of being able to tell you that kind of stuff. So definitely get speaking to them. And also just have a bit of a research and just Google, ELAT testing centres near me, if nowhere at your college does it, though I would think most places probably do. Right. So yeah, it can be taken in school. I took a gap year, so if you've got any gap year questions, let me know. So for me, I went back to my sixth form, even though I'd finished, and they were happy to run it for me along with the kind of cohort of the year after me, because they do run it anyway. So that's another thing to consider, is even if you're planning on taking a gap year, you do need to take it. And obviously, depending on which way you do it, I can go into that if anyone is particularly interested. depending on whether you delay your application or do you defer your place, depends on when you need to take it. How much are you expected to write? How many points should you make roughly? Honestly, it's really hard. That's a really hard question to answer. I get the want to get a kind of hard answer on that. It's really difficult to say. Basically, what they want is for you to be, you want to be analysing a fair few quotes if you're analysing language, and a fair few kind of like examples if you're analysing text structure. I would say you probably need at least 6 to 10 maximum. I doubt you need more than 10 if you're properly analysing them. If you're just throwing them in, then obviously lots more is good. But if you're properly kind of digging deep into them, I can't imagine you'd have time to do more than between 5 and 10 on that, really. In terms of wider points that might be kind of like supported by different quotes, I think I tend to, when I'm writing, I'll probably write 5 or 6 maybe at most. If they're really, really important points, maybe 4. So that's the kind of, that would be my rough idea. But if you've got more detail you want to kind of ask about that, then go ahead. Do you need an external context? Absolutely not. You don't at all. So just get them as they are. In fact, you're more likely to get better marks if you just sort of focus on them as they are, because that's what they want. They want to look at how you analyze stuff that you don't know well. And so kind of showing off how much you know about it isn't really going to help you, because that's not the point of the exam. That's more the point of your A-levels, right? It's kind of like getting in all the different contexts, because you kind of know which text you're going to be studying. Think of it more like, I don't know if you guys have seen the A-level papers, you presumably have seen some of them, or at least or even GCSE, where you do unseen text. Think of it more like that. That's the kind of idea, really, is unseen texts. Also, as someone who has taken this test, do you find it more efficient to order paragraphs by theme or writer method? So it kind of depends on how you're approaching it, right? So if you're approaching it as someone who's saying, okay, well, I can see that both of these texts are using alliteration, and I'm going to explore what the differences are in the ways, though, that affects how you read the text, then I would say put those two things together. Whereas if you were saying something along the lines of, okay, well, I want to talk about what these writers think about a specific theme. So like, for example, I want to talk about how they think about death, as an example, a bit morbid, but what better for a sunny afternoon. If you want to talk about that, then you'd say, oh, well, okay, I think that this person uses this feature to talk about death, and I think this person uses this different feature, and this is what they say about it. And in that case, you would pair them by the theme. In general, the ELAT mark scheme does reward you for kind of mixing your writers together and not doing like paragraph writer A, paragraph writer B, paragraph writer A, paragraph writer B. If you can kind of go A, B and BA and mix them up a bit, that is considered generally, as long as it's coherent, better, because it means it shows that you're more able to like mesh them together more, which is what they want. They want you to be able to respond and kind of mix ideas together very, very easily. And the kind of more sort of confidently you seem to do that, the better. Right, let's have a think about the next question. How long would you give yourself to start preparing for the ELAT? Would you suggest starting now, so it's relatively soon? I think I started properly preparing about a month, maybe 3 or 4 weeks in advance, though that's by no means necessary. I was doing other stuff at the time, so like I couldn't prepare for it every day. Like it was kind of on and off. But I think the earlier you have a look at the papers, the better. There's probably not a too early time to look at the papers and at least get a kind of vague familiarity with them. What I might do actually right just now is I can copy and paste the link to the Cambridge website, which is preparing for the ELAT, which has sample answers, past papers, everything in there. It's very easy to find, but if you want, I can copy that in now, which I'll do. And I'm just checking what question we're at before I do this. Send me to the bottom. Yeah, it has done. That's fine. We'll just scroll back up and find where we were. Thank you guys for all these questions. This is great. The more questions, the better, really, because this is a thing mostly for you guys. Do you need any external content? We've done that one. Efficiency of method. Yeah, so would you start suggesting relatively soon? Yeah, I mean, yes, I say, the earlier you start looking at the paper itself, the better. No time too early to look at that, because it demystifies it a bit, makes it a bit easier to understand. And also, like, in general, I think the two best ways, the only real 2 ways I can think of preparing for the ELAT are basically start doing past papers, see how those go, do one, try and do them under time conditions if you can, because that will help in terms of when you finally get to do it, because you might give yourself a kind of, what's the word, an easier time of it than you would in the exam if you try and do it without time conditions. Maybe start off doing 1 or 2 or writing some ideas untimed, but I think if you're going to write a full answer out, it's worth doing it in time conditions, which also feeds back into the thing of working out if you've got any extra time or exam concessions, because you don't want to be giving yourself too little time than you'll actually have. because you might get 25% extra time if you're dyslexic or you've got any other kind of processing issues or anything like that. So that's worth looking at as well. I believe the date for this year, and I just want to check because I think in case I think a few people have asked about the date potentially. So the date this year, I think, is the 3rd of November. I think that's what Oxford is saying at the moment anyway. Yeah, the 3rd of November, because the deadline for the application is the 15th of October. And then you kind of do it a couple of weeks after that before anyone gets interview decisions. So you're doing it, it's part of the contributor thing will decide whether you get an interview, basically. Though it's not a major part, it's not something that you need to agonize about for hours and hours. I think you can be over prepared for the ELAT. It can sometimes box you in if you're a little bit too in your head about it. Try and go in because what they want is responsivity to the actual text in front of you. So try and go in with an open mind, basically. Oh, and quickly, the other thing I think you can do to prepare is just read lots and lots of reading, as much reading as you can find time for, because that's also going to help you at every level in terms of personal statement, in terms of interview preparation. That's helping you at all stages, because reading is what they want to see. They want to see that you're exploring beyond your subject. And it also just helps you think about words better. Like if you read a book and you go, this isn't on my reading list for A levels at all, or IB if you're doing IB or anything like that, it's not on there. It's just something that I'm interested in reading. Even if you think it's really trashy or childish or whatever, just read it and see. You might enjoy it. And if you do enjoy it, then that says that it's doing something right. And if it's doing something right, try and work out what it's doing right. Work out why you're interested in it, why you enjoy this particular character, what do you like about them, and get down to those real nitty-gritty levels, get down to those linguistic and stylistic levels. What is it about this character? Is it the words they use? Is it the kind of tone they use? What is it? Are they making jokes? What is it about them? Let's see. How high many of the past pages there are passages not included due to copyright issues? Do you know if there's a way around this? Unfortunately, there's not an easy way around the copyright problem. There are people online who do publish full versions of them, though obviously that's shady from legalistic perspective, and I'm not a good person to comment on what that is because I'm not a lawyer. But generally speaking, any passages that aren't available might be available. If it's contemporary poetry, for example, you probably would find it quite easily through something like Poetry Foundation, or just kind of post it online somewhere. If it's an extract from a novel, I mean, your school or college library might have it, or else like a national library. Or if it's a classic or like something kind of relatively old-ish, I mean, obviously a lot of classics are on copyright, so they wouldn't have a problem. The newer classical stuff, chances are Kindle, things like that, which are like very cheap to get hold of, like £1 or something. Otherwise, just try and see it as an exercise. Try and write on the ones that are included, right? If you'll normally be given 6 options, maybe try it with the 3 that are available. And if they are available, that gives you more of a challenge. Write on, if A, B, and C are available, but D, E, and F aren't. Write on A and B, write on B and C, write on C and kind of B, and just do it that way. Is it good to take 30 minutes to plan rather than rushing into starting writing? They don't expect us to write for longer than an hour. Yes, plan for as long as you think you can. I would say as long as you make sure you can write it all in time. Plan for as long as possible. If you're a really quick writer and you can get it all down in half an hour, try that. Obviously, test that. Don't just do it. Test that, and if you can, plan for as long as possible, because planning is really, really helpful, especially for the ELAT. Can you include any context or critics you do know? I wouldn't recommend it personally. Context may be very general context in terms of like the dates. They do give you the dates the text was published. So if you're quite good at your history, you might know that, okay, this text was written at the height of the French Revolution, or at the point at which, the Civil War ended and the slaves were freed, whatever that is. That might be something worth doing. But in terms of critics, unless you're just including a kind of starting quote, maybe. I once included a quote from Oscar Wilde, very, very briefly, but that's not recommended in general. Like, you kind of know what you're doing with that. And I don't necessarily do, but like, having read the mark schemes quite heavily, I probably am relatively okay on it. So that's something that I think is worth bearing in mind. I wouldn't recommend putting in lots of critical stuff. You might be very, very big on Edward Said or on F.R. Leavis or someone, but I wouldn't recommend using them to any great degree. Is there a good structure you can give us? What are the range of texts you like? In terms of structure, as I said a little bit earlier, going through point by point by point, author by author, isn't necessarily a great idea. I mean, you can do that if you want, and you probably still do all right as long as your points are very, very good. But it's much, much better if you can to try and mesh them together and sort of switch between, because it suggests a greater level of confidence. It suggests that you're more kind of at home with analysing texts and that kind of stuff. So that's really worth doing. and the mark scheme does explicitly reward that. The range of texts are usually very, very, very wide-ranging. It's usually a combination of poetry, drama, and prose, and it'll usually be a combination of extracts from maybe longer works like novels or long poems, an extract or two from a play, a couple of shorter poems maybe, and maybe some novel stuff. Every now and again they put something really strange in there, like a newspaper article or something, but that's quite uncommon. Miss Williams mentioned in the video that we should spend at least 6 months to prepare. Why do you think this is? I'm assuming that's for your general application. In terms of your whole application, yes, that is worth doing. And obviously the ELAT forms part of that. So yeah, I mean, the sensible thing to do if you're doing it all in one go is to basically structure it also you're doing a bit of each thing at a time, because that will keep you on track for getting everything done in time. If you're like me, I tend to kind of focus on one task at a time. So like, I don't think I really started going on ELAT stuff properly. I may have had a look, but until after my personal statement was kind of up to a reasonable level, because I wanted that felt to me like a big thing to do. Yeah, I think it depends on what you view as preparation. If you're viewing preparation as like just looking at papers, then yeah, there's no time too early to start. This is as good a time as any to start. But bear in mind that this is happening now, and the ELAT paper happens in November, so you're already kind of more than 6 months, less than 6 months away. So like, I don't think you need to prepare out the ELAT for 6 months necessarily, assuming you're doing it this year, which some of you might be a year below and doing it next year, but we'll see about that. Are they looking for ideas like wider themes or more like analytic techniques and word choices? So basically both. Link one to the other if you can. Start with those basic, like you say, the specific word choices, techniques, that kind of stuff. That's your starting point. That's the most important thing. Get that sorted. Know your techniques and know how to recognize them, whether it be rhyme scheme, whether it be linguistic features like alliteration, that kind of stuff, whether it be structural, whatever it is. Know those. You don't necessarily need to learn lots of technical terms, just know the features and how they work. And that again just comes from reading. And then from that, if you feel confident enough, that's when you start linking it to wider themes. So if you say that this person's alliteration draws lots of attention to whatever, or this form of rhyme scheme does X, Y, Z, and then link it to a theme, that's great, that's brilliant. But that's not the starting point. The starting point is definitely look at the textual features and work out how they kind of link to it. Could you focus your comparison of the text on elements of structure over their approaches to a theme, or is it best to address those things in a quite balanced way, or focus on a theme? I think that's a very similar question to the previous one, to be honest. Yeah, try and do them in tandem. If you're good, if your ELAT comes out well, what it'll come out as very well. I mean, like, you can do a reasonable one, whatever, but if it comes out very well, it'll come out as a combination of those hard foundation of good stuff with kind of the themes sort of coming from that, layered on top of that. My hand diagrams are not very good, but that's what it'll be essentially. Hopefully that helps a bit. Should your arguments be centered around structural and linguistic analysis? Yes, definitely. When can we register for the test? Is it by the 15th of October? I think you register a little bit before that personally. As I say, like, the actual nitty-gritty doing it will depend a little bit on your school. So ask your school first. There is a page, so I linked that thing, the preparing for the ELAT page. On the left side of there is a how to register page, which includes things about authorized test centers. You can find out whether your school is a test center, and there's an article about how to find a test center and funding for traveling and that kind of stuff. I don't know if there's implications this year in terms of COVID as well. So it's worth checking that out with your school as well. As I say, the basic thing is the chances are the vast majority of your schools will do it, do the test center stuff. If they don't, then obviously you need to find somewhere else. But if that's the case, shoot them an email. They'll be geared up. If they're a testing center, they'll be geared up for taking some external students, and they will do it for you. I think there might be, usually you're funded to cover it. So I think it's about £30 or something. But I think that's all funded through whichever testing center you do, as long as you're a kind of UK EU domestic student. So check that with your school as well. But as I say, the schools are the first point of contact for the registration. Definitely check with them. And if you really struggle, get in contact with Oxford or Cambridge admissions people, and they will be happy to help as well. They are very, very good at their jobs. They love talking to people. So don't worry about being a nuisance. You won't be, even if it takes a while to get a response because of COVID and a backlog and stuff. How do we best compare form if we're comparing a poem to an excerpt from prose? I mean, you can talk about it a lot in different ways. So that's quite an interesting question, because it's a lot more about the kind of actual writing, right? The actual process of thinking about a text. So I would say if you're looking at that sort of stuff, the best thing to do is look at the way in which they differ, right? Because they're different forms, so they will naturally differ. But work out what the implications are of that on the reader, or on the theme that they're displaying, whatever it is. So like for me personally, if I was comparing like say a short prose work to a short poem or even a longish poem, okay, so how does the story function? If is there a story, first of all, that's one thing about form. Is there a story, or is it just a scene? Is it a scene about people? Is it a scene about character? Is it a scene about the setting? What's it doing? What's it establishing? What's it setting up? What is it developing? What's it kind of concluding and bringing together? It's basically the same tools. The same tools are at play. It's just on a different scale. So, like, if you were comparing a full-length novel to a short novel, that would be a similar kind of thing. In terms of like things like the simple stuff, like obviously novels don't tend to rhyme, poems often do. Then you could say, okay, what does the rhyme contribute? Like the lack of rhyme in a novel is not going to make too much of a difference because no novels really have rhyme, unless someone's again been reading some weird experimental fiction. But a lot of poems do. Okay, so what about the rhyme in this poem? Or maybe it's irrelevant. Maybe it doesn't matter to your argument, in which case, don't worry about it. You don't have to cover everything. You can't cover everything. Cover the stuff that seems most interesting and best as comparison. Would I have to retake it if I chose to defer my placement? So if you've got a place, so I warn you, Oxford and Cambridge are not particularly keen on deferrals. They do not tend to like deferrals because what it means is they're essentially like reserving a place for someone in the following year, and they don't know if the people in the following year might be better, right? So they're not going to like it. My preferred way of doing it, and the way I would recommend, though obviously take this with a grain of salt, examine the choice yourself, it took me a while to decide this, was if you're going to wait a year, wait to apply, don't wait to defer. So basically apply in the following October, not the October that all your friends are basically applying, because you have a better chance of getting in because you'll have your grades already. You'll have, you don't risk them saying, sorry, we can't defer your place, reject it or don't. You don't risk that. All you have is, these are merits of my grades, because you'll have your grades by that point. This is everything I've got. You'll take the ELAT along with when you apply, so in the year following. So if it was this year, you'd take in 2022. And that's fine. But if you want to defer, then the best thing to do is talk to the college you're applying to, or talk to the university you're applying to, because as I say, Oxford and Cambridge are not particularly keen on it. They can do it, and they have done it, but you're tangibly less likely to get a good result because they're just not fans of it. If you want more information on that, let me know. As I say, I've done a very brief summary there. But I did a gap year where I applied at the end of my gap year. So in October, was halfway through my gap year in the October. I finished A-levels in the July, applied in the following October, got in that January on my birthday, which was a strange day, and then started in the next October. So I saw October 2019 rather than 2018, excuse me, when I would have done. So yeah, that's worth thinking about. But yeah, have a look into that yourself, see what you think. You don't have to retake it if you're deferring, because you've already been offered a place if you're deferring. You only ever really have to take it once, unless you get rejected and want to apply again, in which case, yes, you have to retake it. But that's the only situation, I think, in which you'd have to retake it. Do we find out a result? Do you know what the average score is for accepted applicants? The score really ranges because the ELAT is often used in various ways by various colleges. You can see your result, and you can see the average result for your year. But you usually get that after interviews have been released, so it doesn't really make a difference by that point, because they tend to really use it as a kind of deciding who gets to interview, and then from there they'll kind of consider the application more significantly. And actually, this relates to the next question, which is how significant is the ELAT considering our acceptance? It's not as important as an interview, I wouldn't say. It's a very good tiebreaker if they've got two very similar students, because someone who does work better in the ELAT might be more responsive, and therefore they might go with that person. But generally, it's very contextual. So if you have a really, really bad ELAT, but an amazing interview, amazing piece of written work, amazing personal statement, they'll probably say, okay, person just had probably a bad day on the ELAT day. It's fine. We don't need to worry about them doing the ELAT. We'll kind of disregard that. If your ELAT's great and the rest of the application's a bit strange and a bit terrible or whatever, like they might go, obviously, hopefully they're not terrible, but like a bit kind of inconsistent, then they might think, oh, okay, well, maybe they got lucky, or probably not got lucky. It's probably just a greater chance that they're just very good at working under pressure, in which case that's another good thing. Let's consider that in the context of the rest of the application. It's very kind of contextual to what else is going on in terms of your application, mitigating circumstances, all the other material. So that's something that doesn't really come up too often. Like, it's very difficult to be absolutely sure what the ELAT's going to do for you. But just try and do the best you can, pretty much. And basically the way to do that is answer the question. And the question is, compare these two in any ways that seem interesting to you, taking particular mention of language, style, and structure. Yeah. So that's what you really want to do, is get to grips with the language, the style, and the structure. And if you're really digging into that, you're going to do fine. Most people do very averagely. There are 5 bands. I got the middle band. Like, it's not something, and I got in, right? But I've got friends who did very well in the ELAT and then didn't get in. I would advise, don't look at your score. I don't think it's worth it. But if you really, really want to, you can. They give you a link when they give you your result on how to look at it. But it comes out pretty much after a lot of stuff, so it's not really that. And also, the tutors aren't really looking at the scores. If they want to look at your ELAT paper, they'll probably look at your actual paper. And sometimes the ELAT markers are mad and mark you wrong, and then the tutors will look at it and go, oh my god, this one's great, and it's got a really low score, what the hell, we'll interview them. And sometimes they'll go, oh no, this one isn't very good, we won't interview that person. But it's not, they're not particularly looking at the score so much as the actual thing itself. I'm taking a gap year too and have delayed my application. How did you approach your application with a gap year? Basically, I saw it as a massive advantage because it gave me a year to read everything I wanted to read, have a bit of a rest, because A-levels are bloody stressful, man. They're really hard work. I was exhausted off my A-levels, so I spent quite a lot of time just sleeping and reading, and I did a bit of work, which I think is helpful because it means you come in with a bit of money and can be helpful in terms of if you want to just have more of a lavish time at uni. Equally, if you want to go abroad, that's something else a lot of people do. But it also means, the biggest thing for me was it means I had confirmed grades. So I came out of the exams, got my grades in the August or whatever, and was like, oh, I can now apply to Oxford kind of comfortably knowing that I meet the entry requirements. Whereas obviously the stressful bit, if you're applying in the normal time or with a deferred application, is that basically A-level results day tells you whether you're getting in or not, right? Because if you've got an offer but you miss your grades, that's tough. Whereas the other way around, if you've got your grades and then you apply to whichever unis you think can accept you, then that's a very different system. For example, when I put in my UCAS application, I got one offer in 10 minutes because my grades were high enough, and they were like, okay, cool, this person's got grades, it's fine, we'll do it. That wasn't for Oxford or Cambridge. They take ages because of interviews and all this kind of stuff, and admissions tests and stuff. But that was for another university. So yeah, that's how I'd approach it as a massive advantage, a massive thing that will help you out if you feel you need it. Obviously, if you want to go straight in from sixth form, brilliant, do it. Go ahead. Most people obviously do that. But if you want an alternative approach, that's a really good alternative approach. Do I think deferred application affects your chances of admittance? Yes, I do. I think it affects you slightly negatively. But just to clarify, there is a difference between deferred application and deferred entry and deferred application. So we won't use the word deferred for both. So if you delay applying, that means you don't actually submit, click submit on UCAS until the following deadline. So not the deadline that all your friends are applying at, which would be October 2021. You wait until October 2022 and apply then. That's what I did. A deferred application is where you put in your application, you submit it with all the time with your friends, but you tick a box that says, I want to defer. And basically that means that you get accepted along with all your friends, but you don't start until the following year. That, I think, affects your chances negatively a bit, not massively, but a bit. If you have legitimate reason for doing it, they'll take that into account, definitely. But if it's in terms of your, because of your want to get a gap year, you might as well just apply a year later. You'll still get support from your college, especially if you tell them in advance, I'm going to apply next year. Will you run me as a testing centre for the ELAT? Will you help me with my personal statement? Will you do mock interviews for me? They almost certainly will, because you still go on their admission stats. So, Joe Bloggs from whatever college still got into Oxford or Cambridge. And even if you applied a year late, that's still something that they would be happy about. I was wondering whether you might be able to talk about deferred social labour. Oh, great, I've just done that. Yeah, so deferred is ticking that box on UCAS, applying with all your friends. Delayed is waiting a year and applying late. I would recommend applying late if you want to apply, if you want to delay a year. But if you I wouldn't recommend deferral personally, because I've heard firsthand from tutors, even if they've got a really good student, they are anxious about the fact that there's something might be something better next year. So it's just really, really hard for them, and it puts them in a difficult spot. Is there a date for this year's ELAT? Yes, I think we've talked about that. I think it was the 15th of October. I think that's what we said. That sounds about right. ELAT date. Oh no, sorry, 3rd of November. 15th of October is the application deadline, of course. Let me see what else is going on here. What mistakes are commonly made, and how can you avoid making them? Being too general, not quoting enough, using 3 texts instead of 2, because in the old days you could, you can't now. Don't use 3 texts, use 2. Bringing in too much context and like outside stuff that isn't relevant. Trying to guess what's going on in the rest of the thing. If it's an extract, like if you know Midsummer Night's Dream and it happens to be from Midsummer Night's Dream, don't talk too much about the other side, the rest of Midsummer Night's Dream. It probably won't be from Midsummer Night's Dream, probably like Time of Athens or some Shakespeare play no one's ever heard of. But if it's going to be Shakespeare, so don't worry too much about that. Do you choose any 2 extracts to analyze and compare? Yes, any 2 of the 6 in any combination you want. You've said we don't need to bring in context or know about the text. Is there any reading you would recommend in preparation? Not really anything particular. Read as much as you can of stuff that interests you, because that will help you recognize which texts are going to be interesting to you in the thing. The one that people tend to neglect is reading poetry. I would recommend reading poetry if you're up for it. Whatever kind of poetry you like, modern poetry, old poetry. If you don't know what poetry you like, buy or rent an anthology from a library. Even look up online and just go through and just have a look, particularly a thematic anthology like a war anthology or something, or look at your GCSE or A-level anthologies and, okay, I really liked Philip Larkin, let's go and read some Philip Larkin, or whatever it is, go and read some Caroline Duffy, Simon Armitage. That's modern ones, but if you want to go and read, Robert Browning, or even further back, go back to Shakespeare poetry if you want, is just try and read some stuff. The plays, again, there's lots of plays online at the moment, which is quite exciting, which I'm really excited. I'm big into plays. So there's lots of plays online, which is really cool, because of COVID and stuff. Lots of streaming, often quite cheap streaming if you're up for paying for it. Then there's lots of cheap streams online. There's things like the National Theatre Online thing, which they've got loads of plays on there at the moment. I've just watched one today, which I absolutely loved, called Amadeus, which some of you might have heard of, by Peter Shaffer. That's really great. If you want to just read novels, read novels. Just keep reading, reading, because it will help every aspect of your application, and it helps in interviews. It helps in everything. I remember just before I wrote my personal statement, I read Atonement by Ian McEwan, and then how many months later it was, me and my tutor, who is now my tutor in interview, spent literally half an hour talking about the ending of Atonement, because she hated it and I loved it, and we had a real chat about it. And that was the reason I thought the interview went well, because we went over time, and someone told me she never goes over time. That was really exciting. So just reading could be anything, because they've read loads of stuff, the tutors, so they know everything. Well, they don't know everything, but they know lots. And so they're really excited when someone brings up something that they didn't think anyone else knows, or very few people have heard of, or people just don't talk about. So read as much as you can from whatever ones you want. Don't be restricted by genre if you can avoid it. Don't be restricted by age rating. I mean, obviously, if you're really sensitive to a particular thing, obviously don't delve into something that's going to upset you. But in terms of don't think something's maybe too childish, because you might find real value in it. And if you don't, chuck it away and start something new. Obviously, don't chuck it away. Give it to a library or a friend or sibling or charity shop. Never throw away a book. Is it okay if I've not formed my entire argument, take on the theme, the endo, writing an intro? Can I discover meaning as I go? Yes, definitely. That is something to help by planning. So ideally, your plan will be essentially your introduction will be essentially a summary of your plan. It is quite fun if you can kind of reveal something dramatically at the end, your kind of bigger point, but you don't have to by any stretch, and you can still write an amazing ELAT paper without doing that. Yeah, I would say that's definitely fine. Discover meaning as you go if you want, but do that planning time. Don't skimp on the plan, because it is helpful. I would say at least 20 minutes of planning. Half an hour if you can sort of stretch it, including the writing time. Are we aiming to link to a wider social context within the time period of the text? Thank you too for coming. No, not really. I mean, if you, as I said before, if you kind of notice something about the French Revolution, this happens to be written in 1776 or something, American Revolution just finished and French Revolution is beginning, that's fine. But I wouldn't recommend bringing lots of context, because really they want the merits of the stuff itself. So think about what it's saying, not about what its time would say about it, if that makes sense. Are there grey boundaries? Yes, there are 5 bands. They're very vague, and I wouldn't want to tell you too much about them, because they're not really for you. Therefore, the ELAT markers, who actually in the end only really use it as a kind of workout of roughly how well people do relative to each other. So like, it's not really like, there's no pass-fail grade at all. You could get a 2 on ELAT and your application would still be looked at by Oxford, Cambridge, etc. Because if you've got an amazing personal statement, you interview well and stuff, they're not gonna chuck you out just because your ELAT was bad. Because the chances are it's just because you had a bad day or because you didn't understand something about the text. Would mentioning a niche book in the personal statement disadvantage you? E.g. a football non-fiction book that the interviewer may not have read, so wouldn't have common ground on? Not necessarily, as long as you can find out some literary value. So if you're doing that, you want to talk about like the way it influences your view of reading, or say something you can say about reading, basically, and about texts. Yeah, non-fiction is definitely out of the question. Football non-fiction is not something I know much about, but it's definitely not wrong. Like, I wrote about the Lord of the Rings in mine, which, like, let's be honest, is not the highest brow of fiction ever, but I got in and they liked it. And in my second term last year, I started writing about stuff that had been published about 3 months ago. So it's really not out of the question to write about weird, wacky stuff. They do quite like that sometimes. But if you are doing it, be very careful and think about what you're saying about it and why, because that's the important thing. Where approximately does the threshold lie in regards to lack of quality negative affecting a performance in the ELAT? I think we just talked about that, but basically there isn't really one. If it goes well, then great. If it goes badly, then depending on the context of your application, you might still do very well. How do we say the author presents the theme as without making it seem as the author sat down to write about dancing or mortality? Well, I mean, then you want to talk about the things itself. So like the techniques themselves, right? So like, for example, I could say, you know, this particular person's use of whatever, enter, you know, theme or thing here, enter technique here, influences my perspective or my reading of it or a reader's reading of it, or in context of all these other things, it seems to suggest. That's what putting things like seems and perhaps, if you want, that's kind of helpful. Because then it makes it, you're right. Everyone knows the whole curtains are blue meme, where, you know, the author writes curtains are blue, and then the English teacher goes, oh, well, it clearly represents sadness, and all the author meant is the curtains are blue. But if there's something to say about colour and the way colours are used in a particular text, then that's definitely interesting. You know, if there's lots of different mentions of colour, then that's a thing. That's a technique. That's a linguistic technique that you can definitely look at and analyse. And there might be something really interesting to say about that. It might be something only you've ever said, which is really exciting. How soon after the test do you find the score itself? Quite late afterwards, because I think interview invitations go out in what, sort of late November, early December, and then you're interviewed in mid-December. So, and I don't remember finding out mine until potentially even after interviews. So it's not something that you need to worry about, really. Would you suggest trying to pick 2 different forms, like one drama, one poetry, one prose? Yeah, definitely if you want to. There's no. I'm sorry to say there's no code cracking for this. There's no one-size-fits-all solution that you can tick the boxes off. Basically, you've just got to do what feels right. You've got to do the things that you think are interesting. If those things happen to be across 2 forms, that's great. The chance of finding 2 very similar forms is quite low. They tend to pick 6 fairly different ones. So it'll be like a long poem, short poem extract, maybe one play, a couple of novel things, but they'll be very different periods, so they will look very different. In very different language and stuff. So whichever 2 you pick will be sufficiently different enough to talk about differences. So don't worry about that too much. That's where the practice comes in. You know, work out what stuff works for you in terms of practice papers and things. Is there anything you like about the ELAT? Yes, there is. I know it sounds like I might be being a bit negative about it some of the time. No, I really like it because I think it's really interested. It's really interesting in terms of leveling the playing field. It's really good access because it means everyone's on the same footing. Like, I know someone who is the biggest Tennessee Williams fan in the world. Tennessee Williams came up in the ELAT and she didn't write about him because there were two texts in there that were interested that were more than that. So don't worry about that. I do really like that about it, the way it's so leveling, and it's really exciting to meet some new texts. And maybe you'll come out of it and go, God, I really like that text by Dylan Thomas. I'll go and read some more of him. Would I be surprised to see a translated text come up? Potentially, yes. That's quite unusual. And if it was, they might not tell you it's translated. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. If they tell you it's translated specifically, then obviously that's something to be interested by. Why language, style, and structure instead of language, form, and structure? To be honest, I think just because style encompasses more than just form, because that also would So it encompasses everything really from like, I mean, they don't do it in ELAT because it's all printed in the same thing, but things like typeface, paging, paratext, if there's illustrations, this kind of stuff all comes into style, which wouldn't necessarily come into form. Though, to be honest, they're basically closely synonymous, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. When are the interview invites sent out? It varies a bit, college to college, uni to uni. Somewhere between the ELAT being done on the 3rd of November and before Christmas. So, because they always happen in December. Although this year, obviously, I think they might be online. We're not sure about that yet. So, yes, they should be sometime in late November, early December, I would think. And then you get interviewed in December, usually. Unless there's particular strange circumstance. Is 50% of the ELAT sound score? Yes, that's fine. It's not, obviously the best score in the world, but it's fine. I wouldn't worry too much about that. Who will mark our ELATs? Randomly selected tutors or tutors from colleges or a paper application? Neither. It's school teachers usually, I think, like sixth form teachers, but they're picked randomly from up and down the country, and your papers are anonymised. So you won't have to, if you've got a teacher, Mr. Smith really hates you, he's not marking your ELAT paper, and even if he is, he wouldn't know he is. That's absolutely fine. Is the ELAT the same, regardless of replying to Oxford or Cambridge? Yes, it is. You'll do the ELAT either way. Sometimes some Cambridge, it varies a bit more Cambridge colleges. Some Cambridge colleges, I think, have another test. They make you do the TSA as well. So it's worth looking into that. Although they might not anymore. I know they make the PPEs do it, but I don't know if they make the English students do it anymore. So that's something worth checking out, though that varies college to college a little bit, or it used to. It might be now they don't make you do that at all. The ELAT is the only thing that you're definitely going to have to do, specifically for Oxford and to some extent for Cambridge as well. Obviously, I'm not a Cambridge student, so I don't want to talk for them too much. But that's absolutely not something you need to worry about, really. The tests are identical. So everyone who's applying to Oxford and Cambridge will do exactly the same text, or the same set of six anyway. How many books of text did you mention within your personal statement, and how did you go about discussing them? I wouldn't want to give you my number as a way of a definite, like, to be honest, I don't remember, but I wouldn't anyway, because it's really not about the number as much as it is about what you say about them and the quality of what you say about them. If you spend the whole thing thinking about 3 texts that absolutely blew you away and you see huge numbers of patterns and you're fascinated by them, brilliant. If you write about 10 and you say nothing interesting about them or nothing that you think is interesting about them, then that's bad. Basically, talk about what you're interested about by them. It doesn't just have to be text as well. It can be experiences. It can be lectures if you've been to any lectures or things you've watched online. YouTube lectures are a really great way of getting into lecturing because obviously it's quite hard to get hold of real ones, especially with the current situation. What does an excellent ELAT score say about you? That you're good at the ELAT? I would say. I don't know what it probably says. A little bit more than that. It probably says that you're good at flexible to different sort of styles of text, and you're good at working those through. Though I wouldn't say that it's especially indicative of whether you'll get in or not. I know people who, as I say, who were really good ELAT scores and did quite badly and didn't get in, and really people who got quite low ELAT scores and still managed to get in. So you can't game the Oxford-Cambridge system. It's very opaque. It's very difficult to read into. In the same way that with interviews, if you get sent out after 2 interviews and you don't get interviews at other colleges, that doesn't necessarily say anything particular about your application. Like I only had interviewed at my 1 college at Brasenose and I got in. And some people I know got interviewed at 3 or 4 colleges and didn't get in. You cannot game the Oxford-Cambridge system, much as people want to think you can, and much as people on the internet will tell you can. They're liars or wrong. Any general personal statement advice? Gosh, that's a long question. Essentially, yes. Write about what interests you. Even if you think it's a little bit lowbrow, I'm sure you can say something interesting about it because it's definitely worth this. Every piece of literature has something worth saying about it. Anything else? Make sure your words are okay. Don't read too many other people's ones because you might get influenced by them and you don't want to be accused of plagiarism. That's probably the main stuff. Get some friends or family to read it through. I know it'll feel really painful, like you're bearing your soul, but it's worth doing. If you know anyone who's applied to a university and is doing a degree in English or any other essay subject, really, maybe get them to read it through. Get some friends and family to read it through, even just for spelling and grammar, because if you're applying for an English degree, you really don't want your spelling and grammar to be iffy. Should you try and tackle what may seem like a harder text? Tackle the text you think you get the most out of. If you think there's a text in there that you really have to wrestle with, and it'll take ages to get anything out of it, don't bother. If you think there's one that's got lots of fertile material in, but it's like it's a little bit more complicated, that's absolutely fine. Go for that. I was wondering whether you're aiming to answer the question according to the shared theme of the text or to any extent. No, I don't think we've been asked that yet, so don't worry too much. I mean, obviously, it would be odd to ignore the fact that there is a shared theme, but it's not necessarily something you have to refer to at all. It might be quite hard to avoid it in some cases, and also like don't necessarily stick to the theme itself. You can say, okay, well the theme is here, like the dancing one, for example, which is what I was writing about the other day. It's dancing, but it's also a lot of it's about like a few of them were discussing dancing as like equivalent to life, like dancing is the game of life kind of thing. You're dancing through life, you're using life as a dance, or vice versa, or life's dances are like life, or sort of microcosms of life. The theme itself isn't just static, it can be referred to lots of other things and linked to lots of other things, so don't worry too much about that. Is it possible to type the answers ELAT rather than writing by hand? You'd have to discuss that with your college or school. I believe yes, because there are people who can't write by hand, and if your handwriting is abysmal, then like mine was, though I had to write it by hand, some people don't have to, and the same way you can for your A-levels. But you need to get in contact with your school's disability support for that, because they will be able to help you out with that, and they might be able to assess your handwriting speed and so on, and check whether you would qualify to type it. So yeah, definitely get in contact with them. Definitely do that. Very important to do that. And then questions. If you've got any more questions like about general stuff, I know we've got a few questions coming in about general stuff. We've only got sort of 5 minutes left, but any last questions about general Oxford stuff? Happy to talk about that. Happy to talk about personal statement. So yeah, this last one, or second last now. Can I ask how you choose which college to apply for? Yes, you can. Colleges are funny and weird places. Best thing to do is open days, even if they're online. Do them. Ask about everything if you want to. That's absolutely fine. You are allowed to ask about everything. Look at pictures if that matters to you, if the kind of aesthetics of the place matter to you. I like my pretty little college in the centre of Oxford, so definitely a point to think about. Don't pay too much attention to the reputations that certain colleges have, because like there's reputations. All the colleges have a reputation, and different colleges, according to different people, have different reputations. So it's definitely not too much to worry about. Think about the practical things as well. For example, do they have kitchens in the first year if you want to cook? Do they accommodate you on site for all 3 years? Do they have a gym? Mine has a 24-hour library, which I love to death because I write at weird times, and 24-hour libraries are a godsend for that. Don't worry too much about the tutors. If there's a particular tutor doing a particular specialism thing, obviously apply if you want to, but don't worry too much about that because all the tutors are very good at all the things. But yeah, ideally look at them all. And if you go to Oxford or Cambridge, I think now, especially with the current restrictions, they will show you around most of them if you want to. If you're available to go to Oxford or Cambridge, that's a great way of doing it because you really get a kind of feel for the places. Should you try and have different nuanced answer, or is it best to play it safe? Play it safe in terms of the theme, in terms of the structure and the features, because there are only a certain number of features, right? But just combine them in ways that are interesting to you. So like play it as safe as you want to, but don't worry that you're playing it too safe. If you feel very comfortable and as if you're kind of like, really smashing through it, great, keep going, write as much as you can. But if you feel a bit unwavy and you want to kind of like, step back a bit, maybe look at what text you're choosing. That's why past papers are really good, because it gets you to grips with the idea of doing that. In the ELAT itself, historical context seems to have little value. Is it affected the English course at Oxford, Cambridge in general? Is study based entirely on literary technique? No, not so much at Oxford and Cambridge. That's more the ELAT. So the purpose of that is that you all kind of are on a level playing field. That's what that's there for. Because if you're a particular expert in 17th century poetry, they don't want you having an advantage of someone who is a particular expert in 19th century poetry, but no 19th century poetry came up. So basically what you want to look at is the other stuff, which is the techniques for the actual thing itself, which you seem to recognize. Maybe you look through a past paper or listen to me for an hour. But is study based entirely on literary technique? No, there is quite a lot of context involved. So the papers are actually divided by time period. So the papers are divided by, I think your final honours are in 6 papers. And obviously I'm speaking for Oxford here, Cambridge is a bit different, but you do papers on all the way from Middle English right up to so just before the Victorians for final honours. You do Victorians and modern day in the first year. And basically the idea is to look at everything. look at everything from the historical context but getting right down to the nitty-gritty itself as well. So this is so the ELAT is kind of an experiment in what you're going to be doing a lot more of, which is basically taking the really small stuff, the really individual details, and kind of like boosting that up to the massive, massive stuff, and what that sort of implies for the kind of the world or the viewpoint of the author or the politics around them. Yeah. So there's definitely a lot of history that you can do at Oxford and Cambridge in the English degree. It's definitely not the case that you just do literary technique if that's putting you off the idea of applying. You can look at the paper online, you can look at the course online, but yeah, the fact that they're historically divided would probably tell you a fair bit about that. And I think actually we're bang on time in terms of finishing up. Thank you everyone for coming. Hopefully that was helpful.
Thank you, Tom. That was terrific.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for turning up tonight. Best of luck to you all.